Thomas Whitmore, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat alone in his sleek black Cadillac, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. The Kentucky heat pressed in around him, the car's air conditioner struggling to keep up. A retired businessman who had built his fortune in real estate, Thomas was used to life going his way. But today, he found himself stranded on a deserted country road with a flat tire, far from the comforts of his estate on the outskirts of Louisville. After multiple failed attempts to call roadside assistance, Thomas sighed and leaned back in his seat. Just as frustration threatened to boil over, he noticed a figure approaching in the distance. A young boy, no older than 13 or 14, wearing a faded t-shirt and scuffed sneakers. The boy's gaze flickered over the car before he nodded politely. "Got a flat, sir?" he asked, his voice steady. Thomas exhaled. "Yes. I was hoping to get some help, but there's no signal out here." The boy smiled slightly. "I can help with that." Without hesitation, he crouched beside the tire. "My grandpa taught me how to change one last summer. You got a spare?" Thomas gestured toward the trunk, watching as the boy pulled out the necessary tools. With quiet confidence, the kid worked efficiently, his hands moving with skill beyond his years. As Thomas observed, he felt an unfamiliar humility creeping in, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Once the job was done, the boy wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back. "All set," he said with a satisfied nod. Thomas reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills, offering them to the boy. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." But the boy simply shook his head, taking a step back. "No, thank you, sir. Just glad to help." Stunned, Thomas stood there, money still in hand, as he watched the boy walk away down the road. The encounter left him feeling something he couldn't quite put into words. Alone again, he slipped the bills back into his wallet and climbed into his car. As he drove off, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching as the boy's figure grew smaller against the backdrop of the Kentucky countryside. That evening, Thomas sat in the dim glow of his study, surrounded by towering bookshelves and the soft ticking of an antique clock. His untouched dinner sat beside him, a perfectly cooked steak and a glass of aged whiskey. Yet, he found himself thinking about the boy. In his decades of business, he had met countless people, partners, investors, competitors. Every interaction had been a transaction, an exchange with an expectation. But this boy had helped him for no reason other than kindness. Thomas leaned back, sipping his drink. The kid hadn't looked like someone with much. His clothes were worn, his shoes nearly falling apart, but there had been a quiet dignity about him, an assurance that wasn't born from wealth or privilege. It had been something deeper, something Thomas hadn't seen in a long time. The next morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to find the boy again. He wasn't sure why, gratitude, curiosity, or perhaps something else entirely. Whatever the reason, he found himself driving down that same stretch of road, searching. Hours passed as he stopped at gas stations and roadside diners, asking around. Most people shrugged, but finally, an older woman behind a cafe counter spoke up. "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's always helping folks. Lives with his mama over in Harlan." "Harlan," Thomas repeated, making a mental note. "Thank you." Harlan was a small town nestled in the Appalachian foothills, about an hour's drive away. The road wound through rolling hills and dense forests, but Thomas barely noticed the scenery. His mind was racing with questions. What kind of life did this boy have? What kind of family raised someone like that? When he finally arrived, the town was quiet. Modest homes, small businesses, a sense of familiarity among its residents. After asking around, he was eventually directed to a small house on the edge of town. The home was worn but tidy, its wooden porch sagging slightly under its own weight. Taking a deep breath, Thomas knocked on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered, her expression cautious but kind. "Can I help you?" "Good morning," Thomas said, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday, Elijah. He helped me with a flat tire." Her face softened instantly. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said with a small smile. "He's always helping folks. I just wanted to thank him properly." He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday." She nodded and stepped aside. "He's out back. You're welcome to wait." Thomas stepped inside, taking in the modest surroundings. The furniture was old but clean, the walls adorned with family photos and drawings from a much younger Elijah. It was a far cry from his own home. Pristine, expensive, yet cold. But here, something felt warmer, more alive. She led him to the backyard, where Elijah was hammering nails into a wooden fence. The boy looked up, surprised to see him. "Hey, mister," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Thomas smiled, feeling strangely nervous. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. It wasn't a big deal, but to Thomas it was, and he was determined to show it. As the two of them stood in the warm Kentucky sun, Thomas realized something. This boy had reminded him of a lesson he had long forgotten. Helping others wasn't about wealth or status. It was about showing up. And, for the first time in a long while, Thomas wanted to show up. And so, the journey truly began. Thomas returned to the city with an unfamiliar feeling in his heart. For the first time in years, he felt that he no longer belonged to the world of lavish parties and cold business meetings. His heart was tethered to that small town, to Elijah's family, to the warmth he had long forgotten. A few days later, Thomas couldn't resist the urge to return to Harlan. He visited Elijah and his mother, bringing a small gift, a professional-grade toolset he had asked some friends in the industry to help him find. "I see you have real talent, and if this is what you want to pursue, use this to learn more." Elijah's eyes widened in astonishment and excitement before he broke into a bright smile. "I'll use it to fix other houses in town." His words made Thomas chuckle, but they also warmed his heart. But Harlan was not just a place of peaceful moments. One day, Thomas heard about another family in need. The Carters, an elderly couple living in a rundown house with a leaking roof and peeling walls. Without hesitation, Thomas, along with Elijah and a group of builders he hired, began repairing the house. The community gradually joined in, each person lending a helping hand. Though Harlan was a small town, the kindness of its people was immeasurable. When the house was completed, Mr. and Mrs. Carter were moved to tears. They didn't know how to thank Thomas, but he simply shook his head, his eyes filled with fulfillment. "This wasn't just my doing, it was all of us together." Looking at Elijah, Thomas knew that the boy had been the inspiration that led him to rediscover his true self. Sometime later, Thomas made a bold decision. He moved to Harlan permanently. He sold his luxurious mansion, withdrew from the business world, and dedicated his time to improving life in the small town. Alongside Elijah and the local residents, they established a non-profit organization to help struggling families by repairing homes, providing scholarships for underprivileged children, and creating jobs for the unemployed. Thomas's story did not end with a single act of kindness. It became a movement. Other wealthy individuals began to take notice of Harlan. Some donated, while others came in person to lend a hand. Thomas, who once believed that wealth was the only measure of success, now realized that the true value of life lay in what one could give, not what one could accumulate. One day, as he stood on a porch watching Elijah teach a group of younger kids how to hold a hammer, Thomas smiled with satisfaction. He no longer felt out of place. He had finally found his true home, here, among people who were simple yet rich in kindness. And this time, he knew for certain that he would never leave again.